And it's a special treat to introduce Dr. Ashley Stone, assistant professor in our higher ed administration program. In fact, recently elected by her colleagues to be the director of that program. Congratulations to you, Dr. Stone, and to them, and to all of us. Dr. Stone's research focuses on rural students in higher education. I think we're going to learn some very important um, uh, ideas and hear an analysis of some data that, speaking only for myself, I know I have a lot to learn on this topic. And it's a delight that you can be with us, Ashley. As is usual, you can present, and if you want to, we can hold off on some of the questions and comments until maybe you're ready. But in any case, Meg Holland, our moderator, will be able to facilitate questions and conversation at the right moment. I may have to jump off before you're actually completely finished. Ashley, I hope you forgive me. There's other meetings that I may have to get to, but I'm really, truly delighted to have you, first of all, as one of our colleagues in the school, such a wonderful participant in so much of what we're doing. And today to get a chance to hear about some of your exciting scholarship. So thank you in advance, and
Fantastic.
it's all
Thank
yours.
you so much for this opportunity. While I am a bit anxious to be speaking about my work with so little visual feedback, that's something I'm not particularly used to. I'm really very grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit about my research and a little bit more broadly about rural students in higher education, which is a topic that I care really deeply about. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. So today there are a few things I'd like to do. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I came to studying rural students in higher education, and a little bit about why I believe that's important, just to contextualize the study that I'll be focused on. And part of the reason why I'd like to do that. The study that I chose for this is one that is actually one of the smaller studies that I've done, and yet it highlights a few of the nuances about research on rural students that I really value, and I thought it would be an ideal way to sort of share about this very specific study, but also the work more broadly. And so I'll talk about that. I'll speak a little bit to values that we see within rural communities and the ways in which they might encourage or constrain students from those areas from entering into higher education. This study is actually a follow-up study to an exploratory multi-case study that I did beginning in the third year of my doctoral program. And so I'll speak a little bit to the original study, how this study differed, and also when I speak about the findings, I'll talk a little bit about the nuances in the findings between the two studies. So why rural students in higher education? For me, this is a very personal topic. I grew up in rural Northeast Texas. I know that most of you who have met me are well aware that I came from Texas originally, but I grew up in a very small town of about 3,500 people. That's about 2 hours east of Dallas. Most people ask, what is it near? And I say it's near a lot of other things that you probably haven't heard of, but it's about 2 hours east of Dallas and about an hour from the Arkansas and Louisiana borders. So that's where it's situated, but that's where I grew up and spent my life. Not only did I grow up there, my parents continue to live there. My sisters are in a neighboring community. And really, if you trace back our family, aside from my father's mother, our family has been in that same community or a surrounding community for at least 4 generations that we know of for sure. So we've been in a rural space as a family for a very long time. And so when I graduated from my high school, there were very few other people who left and went into college. So I was one of the few people who I didn't really get to make the decision to go into college. My parents just informed me that is what would be happening, and I agreed and went on. But there were very few other people who attended, who from my graduating class who went with me. And when I returned for my 10-year reunion, I was in the process of applying to go back into a PhD program and thinking about what I'd like to study. And I realized that there were fewer than 10 of us who had obtained any kind of degree in higher education. So an associate's degree, a technical degree, a bachelor's degree, a graduate, any type of degree. And I was thinking back on my own experiences and realized that I felt they were very different than the ways my friends from Dallas or Houston or Austin talked about how their transition into higher education went. And I thought a little bit more about my work in student affairs. My first job was at Purdue University, which is a land grant institution in Indiana, which attracted a number of rural students in the office that I worked in. And I saw how their experiences were different than their colleagues their peers who were coming from Chicago or from Indianapolis. And again, at SMU, I noticed these similar differences. And I thought, this is something that I'd really like to study and understand how we can better meet the needs of these students. And as I began to look to the literature to decide where my research should go, I found that there was very little available. We have a lot of research that's situated at the K-12 level in rural education, a lot about schools that are in rural communities, about the students who are in those schools, and about their academic aspirations, but we don't have a lot of information about these students once they've matriculated into college. And that's likely because they matriculate into higher education at such a low rate. However, we do find that in rural spaces, the high school graduation rates are actually quite high. They fall just below those of suburban, and they're actually, if you look at the NCES data, they come in just second across the geographic locations, and yet they fall way behind when we begin to look at their matriculation into college. Now, it can be difficult with that data. There's not really a one-to-one comparison with the way that NCES breaks up that data, but consistently we find in research that rural students are enrolling in college at lower rates, despite the fact that they have such high school graduation rates. About 2013 to 2015 in Texas, there was really a big move. A notice stakeholders in higher education were really noticing this gap and seeing rural students as a place to tap into this population to meet enrollment challenges for higher education. So we began to see a real opportunity for higher education in rural communities as far as recruiting new students, because we saw, again, these high graduation rates but low matriculation rates. At the same time, we're also seeing from the rural community side a shift in rural economies. Many rural economies are very land-based, so this is what you think of when you consider agricultural communities or mining communities, timber communities. So often either economies that are based on either the cultivation of the land or extraction from the land. But over time, particularly for economies of extraction, so things like mining, both those resources are limited, which begins to shift the economy within this space, and also the additional effects of that type of work on our environment changes our ability to continue with those economies. Even for those, though, who are in agricultural communities that are primarily agricultural economies, the growth of corporate agribusiness has really put pressure on small family farms. And so even if those farms are continuing to run, the ways that those are functioning is really starting to change over time. And so with these shifts in the rural economy, it also opens up a space potentially from the rural communities to look to higher education for ways that they could maybe be more nimble and should be more proactive about how these economies are shifting, and how they can continue to keep their young people in viable careers within the community. The last point I'd like to make is the increasing diversity. There is often when we discuss rural communities, the narratives really fall around a monolithic notion of sort of working class white communities. And while this is a large portion of rural communities, it's a huge disservice if we discredit the many large areas in which we have diverse rural communities that are not white. Patricia Hill Collins, in her work in Black Feminist Thought, talks about the importance as places of resistance for predominantly Black rural communities, particularly in the Southeast. And in Texas, where I've done my own work, we see that actually some of the largest student population in rural communities coming up through our K-12 schools, and therefore the largest student population that could be tapped by these institutions of higher education are actually our Latinx communities along the border with Mexico. And so, again, we are seeing an increasing diversity that exists within these communities, and also an opportunity for higher education to increase their diversity on their campuses, not only in geographic location by pulling in students from rural communities, but also racial and ethnic diversity as well. So those are some of the key points, I think, that bring some salience to why I began this work, and some of the ways in which it's sort of coming to a head that this could be an important part of study in higher education, particularly as we face different enrollment challenges. With that being said, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the research questions that formed the initial study. And what you'll find, what I've tried to do throughout the slides, is to start with, in the darker blue, is the original questions or the original pieces of the study, and then what changed for the study that specifically focused on Latina students from rural communities. So the first study that I completed looked at what are the common values held among college students who left their rural community to pursue higher education, and how did those values influence the choices of college students made about higher education. And so what happened, we completed that first study, and I'll speak a bit more to that, but then I actually received a grant from our school to do a follow-up study to really hone in on and focus on the similar questions, but focusing specifically on Latina students from those rural communities. As we moved into the second round of that study, I was actually joined by two additional colleagues who were interested in the work. The one was a cohort member of mine who was Latina, but from an urban area, and the other was a woman that I worked with who was pursuing her master's degree in the same program, who was a Latina woman from a rural community. And so they were very invested in what we were doing and were able to join me on this follow-up study. So to start with, I think it's important for me to take a step back and talk about defining rurality. One of the first challenges that anyone who's going to do research in rural spaces faces is how they will define what rural means. The reason that can be so challenging is that there have been over 24 definitions of what rural is from the federal government, and there are even more when you move to the state level. Depending on which definition you choose, that means that you're including or excluding different groups of people. Additionally, many of those definitions can be problematic. They're often very focused specifically on questions of population density, and they're actually often urban-centric. So there's a lot of time spent on deciding how we define urban, and then once we've defined urban, just saying, okay, everything else we'll just call rural, rather than ever trying to have an understanding of what rurality is in its own right. And so for the sake of this study, I asked students to self-identify as rural. And so they were the ones who came forward and said, I identify as rural. I identify the community I grew up in as rural. And so they had some agency within that, and that allowed us to also speak a little bit, talk to each other about what that meant to them, for their community to be a rural community. And then the second piece was that I did use NCES. While they do have an urban-centric model, what I did was I actually used both their rural and town categories. So if you're not familiar with how the NCES does their geographic locations, it is connected to the census, but it starts by defining the urban area and suburban areas, particularly by size, and then towns and rural communities are actually defined in their distance from those urban areas. And so I used sort of the broadest scope of that, both town and rural, within NCES, and then had the students self-identify to sort of create a boundary for the study. So, with that being understood, I wanted to come back and talk a little bit about what the literature says about values within rural communities. And the first thing I think that comes up when you begin to look at the information about rural communities are the value of community itself. And there are strong community ties. I know that having lived around a lot of different people, people from different cities have a lot of pride in their cities. So they're really excited to be from Houston or Austin, and they're really proud to talk about what that means to them. I think that this looks a little bit different for rural communities. It's not necessarily just that there's a strong pride in being from that community, but that people are really strongly tied to both the physical space of it and to the other community members there, and a pretty broad portion of the community members there. And I believe this often comes from the ways in which people in rural communities' lives overlap with one another. So, for example, one of the things that students would talk about a lot is as they grew up, their lives, they were in classes with the same people that they played sports with, in the same classes that they were in Cub Scouts or Girl Scouts with, and the same people they went to church or to their worship services with. All of these different things were with the same people. Part of this is because many of them talked about having only one of things in their community. There's only one elementary school, only one high school, there's only one grocery store. So as they're living their lives day to day, their lives overlap a lot with the other community members, and it creates these really strong ties. As a result of having these really strong ties, there are concerns that happen about outmigration that can be caused by higher education. So often what you'll see in these rural communities is that when students leave to go into higher education, they're not returning back to the community. Carr and Cabalas talk about this as their achievers, that we often pour a lot of educational resources into students who leave and go into higher education, but that the students rarely return back to the community. And we'll talk a little bit in the next slide about why that is. But for a space where there are such strong ties, that can be a real concern, both for the community as they're encouraging students to potentially go into higher education, and for students who have developed those strong ties and realize that that's a decision that might mean they won't return to this space. Which brings us to talking about the value of education. So I spoke before about the shifting economies within these rural spaces, and that they're often focused on land-based economies. This means that often the skills and training and knowledge that are most valued through education in these rural spaces are focused on the skills and knowledge that are necessary for, again, that local economy, whether that be agricultural, mining, whatever is the business of those specific economies. Those are the things that are most valued within education in those spaces. This can often be very technical skills or manual labor skills that can be more, because those are what are most closely aligned with those rural economies. This also means that for students who are interested in careers or excited about interested in careers that fall beyond what they believe the local economy can support, as early research has found that as early as junior high, so 7th and 8th grade, students are beginning to negotiate what means more to them to pursue a career that they are really potentially excited about but don't believe their community could support, or staying attached to the community they're a part of and thinking about the options they have available to them there. So those were the two main buckets of literature that that I really explored for the original study that looked at rural students broadly and the values that might be hindering or encouraging them to go into higher education. When we moved the study to focus specifically on our Latina students, we also added the bucket for the value of family as we were doing our research, specifically to add to the literature on our Latina students. We found that family was really important. Not that it's not important to all rural students, not that family is not important to other spaces, but it was particularly important for us to address this within the work of this study. And for the value of family, some of the things that I wanted to highlight was particularly for these women, there is a paradox of navigating both individual and family roles. So in the same way that I talked about some of that tension that exists around economic viability for some students and their commitment to their community versus what they might be interested in going into in the future as a career, for these women, it was really about maybe some of the individual roles that they felt that they wanted to pursue versus the role that they believed they had within their family. This also was really important. These studies also revealed that this was particularly important for students or for these young women, that it was more so salient for young Latinas rather than Latinos, and that it was really also focused around concerns about the financial, about potentially becoming a financial burden by going into higher education, thinking about their fiscal responsibility to their family. Their family was planning to support them as they were in college. Would the school they're choosing be a financial burden? If they had previously contributed to their family, would they be able to continue to contribute in the same ways, depending on how far they moved away, if they would be able to continue to work? So these were really important considerations we found in the literature for Latino women who are considering going into higher education. The second thing that we really found is that women in the family, particularly women in these Latino families, really provided the predominant role in setting expectations and providing support for post-secondary decisions. I will say this actual finding came out between the first and second versions of our manuscript, but it came from some dear friends of ours at UT Austin, so we were happy to be working with them, and you'll see an echo of this finding in our own research. So now I've talked a little bit about thinking about the values within these different contexts. I'd like to take a second to talk about how we conceptualized it for the sake of this study. We looked to the Encyclopedia for Social Sciences and thought about this as conceptions. You'll see here from Sills, while this is older, it talks about the conceptions of desirable that influence selective behavior. We were interested in this piece because it really connected not only what is valued or what are stated values or things that should be desired, but that it also influenced the actual behaviors that people, so these are values that are actually lived out and inform decisions and behaviors that happen. The second piece of is that it was a part of a system of social power providing ideological frame that shapes public discourse about how social world is operating and how it should operate. This piece we thought was really important because it helps to identify the sort of social context that these values are actually being created within. So in the original study, I actually did not have a specific theoretical framework. It was an exploratory study as a result of how little research I was finding focused on these students. And so I did come at it with a critical paradigm, knowing that we live in a very urban-centric space. I was trying to really look at what are the values that these students are talking about and bringing into our college campuses, but there was not a specific framework that was used. However, when we went back to do the follow-up study, we look specifically at Chicana feminism. Dolores Delgado Bernal talks about the ways in which critical race and gendered epistemologies offer unique ways of knowing and understanding that are based on these actually race and gendered experiences. And we felt that was very important for the women that we were including within this study. Additionally, using a framework like this really allowed us to honor the resources that the women who were participating in our study gleaned from the culture in their homes and the ways in which they were leveraging those in the decisions they were making about higher education and in their time on our college and university campuses. Additionally, Chicana feminism, just so that you know a little bit about it, focuses on biculturalism, bilingualism, and a commitment to family and community. It also highlights the ways in which Spanish is devalued, contradictions that can come up with Catholicism, patriarchal ideology, issues of immigration, and it also addresses the pursuit of education and social justice. These are some of Dr. Delgado Bernal's work, spans many years, and we used a lot of different pieces, but this is some of what she highlights through her work on Chicana feminism that we looked to as we began to explore this study. The methodology for this study was a multi-case study. So even the first study was a multi-case study. For the sampling criterion in the first study, the students needed to have grown up in a in a rural community. Again, that was defined by the student that it was rural. As far as grow up in, as we spent a lot of time working through this, we found that most students determined that it was their hometown and that they grew up there if they spent their high school years there. So it took us some time to find where that natural grow up, how long they should have lived in the rural community should be. But what we ultimately found, and this actually came from some other studies that I had done, was that those students who lived at least their high school years within the rural community really attached to it and found that that was the space where they grew the most and informed sort of their own identity the most as they were growing up. I asked that they have moved away from the community in order to attend college and be currently enrolled full-time at a four-year college or university. So those were all the criteria for the first year, or for the first study. And in the follow-up study, we actually explicitly stated that we wanted to pursue Latina students within, they also needed to self-identify as Latina. The data collection, there were a number of different pieces of data collection. So we had an initial survey that went out through different email listservs. This was an opportunity just to gather some initial demographic data from students to make sure, again, we could get their hometown, make sure they fell within that town or rural category within CES. We were able to gather what class they were in or what classification they were at within their time studying, what their major was. So some of that general information and also enough information to let us start the interviews. The main data collection source were 2 interviews that were done with each student. These were pseudo-structured interviews. The first interview really talked about their hometown, what it was like to grow up there, the ways in which they formed their values there, what were the things that they valued, how did their home community influence those values. And then in their second interview, we really focused on the ways that those values we learned about and talked about in the first interview informed the decisions they were making around higher education. The decision to go into higher education in general, the decision of where to go to school, what to major in, etc. We also had students use artifacts for this. So we would ask them to bring in artifacts that they felt represented the things that they valued in their life. So for example, one student brought in a very decorative cross that her aunt had given her before she came to school. And she talked about how she would look at it often at night. And when she prayed at night and looked at this cross, it not only made her feel closer to God, but it made her feel closer to her family because she knew that it was a symbol that they were praying for her as well. And so she talked about the ways it represented her own faith and the love that her commitment to her family and their commitment to her, and how she valued both family and faith. And that was an artifact that represented that. We also had documentation. Students also submitted different types of essays, maybe that they felt exemplified their values, whether that be the essays they wrote to get into college for different scholarship opportunities. We had one who submitted her salutatory address to her graduating class, but different things that they felt like they had an opportunity to really express and live out their values. And one of the other pieces that we looked at was had them talk through their social media. So the students would sit down with us and show us their Instagram feeds or their Facebook feeds and talk about the ways that they felt the values and the things they said they care about were exemplified in the ways that they lived their life and were demonstrating or showing that they valued things through these social media feeds. So that was also used sort of as a digital artifact as we worked through that. And then finally, archival records. This mostly focused on the information that we gathered about the students' communities, to think about the demographic makeup of the communities they were coming from, how large, again, how the schools in the area were classified, as well as some of the political leanings. So we looked at the voting returns for the past few years of the different communities to sort of see ideologically, politically, where is there variation between the different the different communities. For the data analysis, again, in the first version, we had multiple rounds of EMIC coding because it was an exploratory study, and then looked through axial coding to see what the relationships were between those. And then after each case was analyzed as an individual case, as its own study, we then did a cross-case analysis. For the second round of the study, we actually used edict codes that came from the Chicana Feminist framework, looking at biculturalism, bilingualism, immigration, conflicts within capitalism, and commitment to community and family in particular. So we pulled these different pieces from the framework to look at them in that pace. Some participants participated in both versions of the study, and I made sure that the new team members went back and recoded all of the work that was done with the students for the first time that were in the first study, since I had already coded them once, that they got clean copies and recoded them just to have sort of fresh eyes on that work as we were reanalyzing those specific pieces. So the participants, we had 5 total. Again, this was one of my smaller studies. We had 5 total participants in this study. There was actually a 6th participant who finished the survey and both of the interviews with us, and all of her stuff really echoed a lot of what the other women were saying. But since she didn't submit any of the artifacts or the other pieces, we decided not to fully include that, since it was an incomplete sort of case, not to include it in the study. But we do want to say we're grateful for her time and want to say that that what she said really echoed a lot of what the other 5 participants had to say. As you can see, they were either fell in the first year or senior category, so we sort of had them on both ends of the university spectrum. They were from a number of different majors, though all of them though they were primarily in helping majors, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. 4 of the 5 were from predominantly Latino communities, and of those, 4 out of 5 were also from strongly Democratic-leaning communities, and there was one student who came from a predominantly white community that's political leaning was particularly Republican. So now I want to speak a little bit about the findings from the study. The biggest thing that comes back, I think, to our initial talk about the family values are that there were 2 sub-findings under the importance of familial influences for these young women, and particularly the influence of matriarchs within the family. The women within the family, the older women within the family, were very important in informing the students of their informing the students' desire to go into higher education, encouraging them to pursue those dreams, and then supporting them once they got onto campus. Now, we did find something similar with the original study. There was a lot, all across that study, another theme was the role of mothers and grandmothers in encouraging students to go into higher education. However, for these women, that really expanded out. While here I'm offering an example, a quote from Sylvia, who's speaking about her grandmother. She talks about her grandmother playing a huge factor in her coming to college, because it wasn't for her pushing me. She said, I don't know, like, I knew I was going to come to college and do everything, but because of her, I want to push further. Sylvia was one of the first-year students, and she already knew that she wanted to pursue a graduate degree. And a lot of this was inspiration from her grandmother. And for her, it was very hard to leave her grandmother to come to college, but she felt that spirit and encouragement from her and felt like she was really making her grandmother proud by what she was doing, being in school. This was also common for students to talk about their tias or their aunts, and talk about older cousins and siblings who also had paved a way for them to understand what it meant to be going into higher education, and to encourage them to do so again. And then once they were in college, actually supporting them and encouraging them to stay there, and offering support for them to be successful once they were there. The next piece is about honoring hardships. And this was about, again, sort of connected to what the literature talked about earlier about this conflict or paradox that the students could face between their own individual roles and the roles they saw of themselves in the family. They saw that their families were sacrificing for them in order for them to be in college. But rather than really feeling guilty about being in college, they really saw it as they've sacrificed for me to be here. I need to be here and I need to really take advantage of this opportunity. I need to honor the work that has been done by doing well while I'm here. Julia, her is the daughter to a single mother, and she talked about how her mom wanted her to see the world and do all the things that she couldn't do as a young mother. Um, and that she wanted her the reason, and that she talked about that's the reason why she wanted to go to college. She wanted to make her mother proud, because she'd gone out of her way to make sure that she could see the world was so much bigger than just the community that they grew up in. Again, this is consistently seen through other women who talked about the sacrifices their parents were making, or their whole family often had made in order to make sure that they could afford to go to college, and that they would have those opportunities. And they saw that really honoring that, showing that they honored that sacrifice, was important for them as they continued to push through, and not only make it into college, but make it through. Two other findings that we found were promotion of education and helping others. So one of the things that I noted before was that if you look at the majors, a lot of the majors that the women were pursuing were really in helping professions. So nursing, education, psychology, and social work. And even the one student, Julia, was actually a public relations major, but she talks about how the reason she wanted to be she was a public relations major, but was also pre-law and wanted to get her law degree so that she could mediate divorces, because she saw the toll that the divorce that her parents went through took on her mother and the other children, and she wanted to be able to keep families from suffering if they had to go through those processes. And so even she really talked through the ways in which her career decisions were about helping others. And so I'll actually, since I've gone a little bit out of order, I'll also talk about Sarah. Sarah was one of our students who was a nursing degree. She had been the salutatorian of her graduating class, and many people said, why do you want to be a nurse? You could go and be a surgeon. You'd probably make a lot more money. Why isn't that what you want to pursue? And she said, she had actually had a car accident when she was younger and spent a long time in the hospital. And so she had spent a lot of time around different surgeons who had helped her recover, as well as nurses. And she thought, for a surgeon, you just care about the health of the patient or health in general. She said, you don't necessarily need to know the family or need to know their insights, insecurities of the child or the patient in general. I feel like nurses get more involved, and I'm one of those people that want to care for somebody. I want to care, help them with their families, help them with their struggles, and ease their pain or ease their mind. She really felt that through nursing, she would be able to create stronger connections with her patients and her family as a part of the practice, and that's what was most important to her. So in addition to sort of these helping professions, the other piece that came back again was promoting education. I talked a lot about how these matriarchs really helped these women decide they wanted to go into higher education and encourage them, but they saw themselves taking on that same mantle as they went through college. There was sort of the torch was being passed to them that they could continue to encourage those who are coming up behind them. As Julia says, she said, I always feel very blessed, and I make sure to share that with people because I didn't really do it for myself. I do it for my family so that they can know that I appreciate them. But there's also because I want people who are an underclassmen or people who are just barely starting high school that I know on social media. So this is part of us talking about that social media piece. They can see me on social media. I want them to know that it is possible. I didn't get automatic admission to the university. So I love sharing my story with other people about that because I feel like it is possible. She felt like she was really a story that other people could look to see that she could come from their small town and be successful in higher education, that she could be a Latina woman from a rural community and be successful in college. And she could set that example and be that encouragement for those who were coming behind her in the same way those who had led the way before were for her. So again, these were some of the main findings. One of the other differences that I'll talk about that's a little bit nuanced from the broader study to this one is back with the helping others piece. And that is that for all of the students who really were interested in leaving their rural communities to pursue higher education, they weren't so much concerned with finding a job that would pay well, sort of an end goal, but they were really focused on fulfilling careers. So things that they thought would be exciting, engaging, but that they thought would be fulfilling long term in their life. And that was why they chose to pursue. They felt that a degree was necessary for the specific careers they had chosen. But for these women who participated in the study, it was really specifically that fulfillment was coming from the ability to help others and make a real difference and care for others. And they also spoke a lot more about that happening, even if they didn't plan to go back to their community, contributing that back to their community or promoting it back in their community a lot more than the rest of the other students did. So just in sort of closing, I want to talk about just a couple of other things. One of the things, again, that we talked early on about the value of family, that really was reinforced through the findings of our study, that family was particularly important, and again, echoing the role the women in the family were playing as a predominant role, and that the women now, these Latinas, from rural communities now saw themselves as a conduit for transferring those values, particularly concerning education, that they were receiving that from the matriarchs of their family, but that they also wanted to pass those on to younger siblings, younger cousins, other people in their high schools who were following in behind them. And that there was a sense of responsibility to succeed, again, both to honor the hardship of the family, but also, again, this connects back to that earlier literature that talks about that tension that they can face between the individual roles and the familial roles. And again, not wanting to be a burden. I think a lot of them felt like, if I'm going to take this risk to be in college, if that could potentially be a hindrance, that it's really important for me to be successful. It's important to honor sort of maybe that strain that they felt like they might be putting onto that. And again, I talked again about the importance, particularly of matriarchs within this frame. And finally, the commitment to community, which I think came through even more clearly with the women in this study as opposed to the larger study, and the ways in which they again saw themselves as role models, not only for their own younger siblings, but for the other community members. And I think that that's really important for us to think about as we look to what some of the implications for this work can be. First of all, in recruitment, I think in two different ways. First of all, if we're seeking to recruit students into higher education from rural communities, I think it's important for us to note the nuance that this is not a monolith, that there are nuances between these different rural communities, not just geographically, but again, racially and ethnically. And as we specifically look to recruit the students, that means that we need to tailor the work that we're doing to recruit those students to meet their specific needs and to understand their specific cultures within these rural Latino communities. I think that that could particularly mean focusing on supporting the matriarchs within families, helping them feel good about encouraging their young children to go into higher education, particularly the young women in their family, and making sure that they feel confident in the role that the university will play in supporting them. But I think also by building strong relationships with these young women, we see that they already want to go back and want to set a good example for those who are falling behind them. So how can we hire them to work with our admissions, to talk about recruiting, continuing to recruit students from their home communities and encouraging sort of a pipeline of students into higher education that is built with people who really understand the community and the culture itself and can speak to the ways that our institutions are supporting them. One of the other pieces I think is important for us to consider is that the women really spoke a lot about the ways they continued to receive support from their families as they transitioned to higher education, but not so much about how the campuses were supporting them. I think that we need to spend some more time in higher education thinking about the ways that if we are going to actively recruit students onto our campuses, the ways that we're also preparing ourselves to adequately support those students. And so additional research needs to be done to see what are those specific needs. How can we both engage the family support and support the support the support that's coming from families. How can we help create greater capacity for that without adding additional strain potentially to family members, but also provide our own support that's really tailored to these unique groups of students. And I think, again, also honoring the knowledge of the home. These women are coming with really deep values that are connected to helping others pursuing education, and honoring their history. And so how can we look to those values and help them continue to live those out on our college campuses? I do want to make one quick note at the end that I talked about before, that this was conducted in Texas. And so earlier when I talked about, while we use the term Latina throughout, these were predominantly Mexican American identifying women. And so this is a very narrow segment. And I don't want to pretend, again, that the Latina community is also very homogenous. And so there are limitations within this study due to likely the geographical scope of where it was conducted, but hopefully still a helpful starting point as we think about rural students broadly, but also the fact that nuance exists among them as we think about how we can both tap into them as a resource for our institutions, but also genuinely support them once we're here. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much. Really, really fascinating work. Gives me an appetite to read more, and I'd like to get my hand on the paper and all the rest. So this was wonderful. Let's turn it over to Meg to manage the flow of questions and comments. People, I suppose, can either just send their question in, or Meg can unmute you, but I think we already have a few that have put their comments and questions in the queue. So Meg, you want to take over?
Sure, thank you. Dr. Stone, Dr. Grant has a question. First, she says, thanks for the interesting presentation. She understands that rural families struggle in encouraging higher education when increased education so often leads to students leaving their families to pursue jobs in faraway places. Did your students' sample speak to these issues?
You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Am I unmuted now? Okay, thank you. Sorry. So yes, so I think that one important thing to note is that I did actively seek out students who had already left their community to come into college. So there are definitely a lot of students who did not make that decision. Again, part of why I focused on that is because it's such a small group. And so I wanted to know, since it's so unlikely that they would make that choice, what were some of the things that they cared about and valued that encouraged them to make the choice? As they were going into higher education. But yes, they still reported those concerns. And again, I think that there is this tension in the same way there's tension with a lot of people that they were going away. They wanted them to stay close as a part of their family. And for some of them, they did make a choice. Well, they made a choice to leave and go to an institution and one that may be a few hours away. They made a choice to stay closer as opposed to a decision to go to another state or a much further away university. And so that was sort of the balance that they found. Interesting, because those students were still in school, we weren't really able to negotiate or talk through as much what were their decisions about the next steps. So again, they saw this as going away, leaving to go to college, but they weren't talking as much about what did it mean then to not necessarily return to their hometown. Some of them were thinking of, and I think that part of this too, one of the things that came from these women more so than from the broader group when we did the original study of that was about rural students more generally, is that these women, even if they weren't planning to return to the community, planned to stay really engaged with the community. So even if they didn't plan to move home, they were still really invested in going back home to talk to students about going into college or going back home to help provide services from time to time. And so even if they weren't planning to move back, they really planned to stay stay engaged with the community. And that came through a lot more than it did with the broader rural student population that had come in. And so I think that part of that does have to do with both the strong ties that they had to their family and their family wanting them to stay close. But I think that you would likely also, for those who didn't leave and go out to college, that you would find a lot of families who that was a big concern, and part of what kept them from really wanting to encourage them to leave was that they were afraid they wouldn't return back to the community.
It's 5 o'clock.
Sorry, Dr. Stone, the next question is, to what extent do influences outside the family, like teachers and schooling dynamics, influence college enrollment?
So this was actually something that I was fascinated by both in the original study and in this follow-up study, and that was that students spoke very little, surprisingly little, about about the teachers and different like high school guidance counselors and things like that when they discussed their enrollment in college. It was really much more focused, again, often on their family as an influence for that. And then this could be for a couple of reasons, and one of those has to do with I referenced a work that's by two scholars, Carr and Kafalis, and they wrote a book called Hollowing Out the Middle, and they really talk about the ways that our colleges and universities can focus in on just a couple of students to get them out the door, but those are often all the students who are already being encouraged by their families, again, to pursue this. And so we were really surprised to see I was really surprised, and then my colleagues were, once we finished this, to see sort of a lack of them talking about the ways in which their teachers were forming those values. Julia did speak about one teacher who had traveled a lot, who shared a lot about her travels and sort of this idea of seeing the world that influenced her. But again, the most predominant ones were coming directly from the family, and few others mentioned any of their teachers, which was a little sad. But the other piece of that I think about that I think could be potential, and I think there's a space for more research in, is that a lot of times these students don't just identify, in rural communities, don't just identify their teachers as their teachers. Their teachers are often also, again, an aunt, a cousin. Their teachers are their best friend's parents, are involved with them in all different parts of their life. And so the ways that I talked about that overlap before, I think that there are lots of ways where they sort of talk about community encouragement that might be specifically about teachers, but they don't see their teacher in that singular capacity in the way they're not surprised to run in their teacher at the grocery store or in all other parts of their life. They're used to that. And so I also wonder if they don't think there could be more investigation around the ways they talk about the community as the support and encouragement, as opposed to specifically the school or a specific teacher, because they see those teachers in so many different roles within their life, as opposed to just the teacher within their classroom.
Dr. Stone, we have a couple questions that seem to go together, so I'm going to give it to you in 3 parts. Are mothers of these participants giving them no alternative but to go to college? And did any participant feel conflicted about balancing their college expectations and their responsibilities of helping out at home? And did any of the students or matriarchs of the families, were they concerned about the higher education costs and student loan indebtedness? And were there any conversations about the financial concerns during college? So that's a 4-part. Sorry.
Yes, so I'll try to speak to those, and maybe sort of in one like larger answer speak to a few of them. Yes, the financial concerns were very important. A lot of these students were very high achieving in high school and were able to secure scholarships, but they talked about that being a part of their decision-making process. Again, a lot of them really were conflicted about this idea of what kind of financial strain might going to college put on their family. And so they were really trying to make sure that the decision that they made, they were really hoping that it would not, we're trying to avoid putting any financial strain on their family. And particularly, I think, an aversion to thinking about it as loans, but just like their actual ability to pay. And for many of the young women, even if they're receiving some support from their family, you could tell that they really felt a responsibility. And I think, again, in that discussion of the honoring the hardships that they had gotten, it was important for them to get their scholarships and to be able to keep their scholarships so that they can continue within to continue their education, and without putting additional strain on their family. Some other ways that they talked about this, though, was hoping that they would be able, so some of them wanting to graduate early and finish their college early so that they weren't in school for as long and potentially not having to pay as much, being able to start their careers earlier and be able to support their family. So particularly the participant Sylvia talked a lot about, she had a number of younger siblings, how she knew that her parents were not likely to want to take money from her after she graduated and was able to begin to help support them. But she really cared about the work they had done to support her. And so she talked about having conversations with her sister about how once she graduated, she was going to get a job and send her sister money to help support the family, to sort of sneak the money back into the family's budget so that she could relieve some of the strain, that financial strain she knew her family was experiencing. But again, that was never keeping them from wanting to pursue higher education. They really saw this as an opportunity for their families really saw this as an opportunity for the young women, and that even if there was some sacrifice necessary, that in the end it would be worth it. But the students, again, that honoring the hardships piece was really where I think that came out for these students, in that tension that they felt between knowing that there were sacrifices being made for them to be there, and that it was important for them to work hard to be in all of their classes, to really make the most of this opportunity, that was the way that sacrifice could be seen as worthwhile and potentially get them to the place where they could begin to pay that back with their family.
So a follow-up question to that, since you mentioned mothers supported these students, do fathers in these rural communities encourage support of these students?
So I would not say that the fathers do not support them, but they were not discussed. Similar to the teachers, they were not discussed in the interviews. Again, a lot of the focus on this was, again, and not just on, yes, mothers were important, and they were talked about the most, but also grandmothers, aunts, older female cousins. So really, it was female family members more broadly that were discussed as encouraging them, and none of them really spoke about their fathers. Now, they also did not speak about their fathers discouraging this, but it was really a lot of discussion about how women in their lives, particularly women in their families or in other families that were closely connected to them, were encouraging them. And so I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it was not something through all of the different questions we asked that ever came up in their interviews.
So the next question is, again, a bit of a three-part question. So first, somebody asks how you recruited participants and what struggles you encountered in recruitment as an outsider to the community. And a follow-up to that would be, were all of your participants born in the US? Were any of them dreamers? And how might that have affected their decision to attend higher education? And were any of them, and how did that influence their decision to attend a predominantly white institution or a Hispanic serving institution?
Yes, so so recruitment was broad. So it happened in phases. This was an interesting study, but predominantly it happened through different listservs at the University of Texas at Austin. It wasn't specifically based there, but that was the starting point, and then sort of snowballing out from there to recruit participants. So it was primarily snowball effect. All of these students, all of these students were born in the United States and had citizenship here, so none of them were dreamers. And again, I do think that that could influence, again, those are other factors that influence their decision to go for where they were going to go to school. Some of the participants in the previous study were not students at the institution, but by the time we got to this point and narrowed it down to the Latino students, they were all at that specific institution. And so, again, it was through various listservs and, again, a snowball sampling from there to find others who might be willing to participate. It can be really challenging, just as recruitment in any process can be, it can be challenging, but those are also things that are influencing the nature of the students who are able to, I mean, again, all of those different factors, because those are additional limitations because of the structure of the study, because I asked that they have left their community to come into higher education and be enrolled in a four-year institution. That we reached out to students who fell outside of the university, but never received any response to those calls. And so that was sort of a consequence. It wasn't that was the only thing we did, but that was in the end the only students who actually completed their participation with us. But again, I think that those are all things that limit, again, the number of students who are willing to participate. They've already overcome a number of those barriers that you're talking about before they even met the criteria to participate in the study. But I would guess that those are all influences. And I say that knowing, I mean, I worked in an office where we specifically supported Dreamers, but none of those students were connected to the study. So they were there at the institution, but did not participate. I don't know that they were specifically rural, but did not participate in this study.
A related question is someone's interested to know whether acculturation or bicultural identity development were factors that you and the team considered, or if they were mentioned by participants to have had an impact on their educational choices.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So someone is curious to know whether acculturation and or bicultural identity development were factors that you and the team considered, or if they were mentioned by the participants to have had an impact on their educational choices.
Yes. So actually, so that's interesting. That's something that I think goes back to maybe a part of a previous question that I don't think I addressed, and that was about their decision to come to a predominantly white institution. I showed earlier in the participant breakdown that the majority of the students were coming from a predominantly Latinx community, and there was only one who came from a predominantly white community. And when we say there was a predominantly Latino community, I mean that the population was between like 94 and 99% Latino. So for these students, one of the things that they actually talked about a lot, particularly for the students who are coming from those communities, once they were on campus, one of the things they talked about a lot was, I don't think that they hadn't really thought a lot about the fact that it was a predominantly white institution, because they had not really fully considered what it meant to not be in that predominantly Latino and really predominantly Mexican American studies. Many of the students talk about the ways in which they'll say like the border crossed their family, not that their family crossed the border. And so that their family has this rich, long tradition there, but that they identify as Mexican or Mexican American, but that the culture is so very strong where they are living, and that they hadn't really understood how deeply embedded within that culture they were, or that they were able to be so surrounded by their own culture until they left and came to this predominantly white institution. And then I think that was a shock to the system for those students. On the flip side, the one student who came from the predominantly white community, again, that predominantly white community was over 90% white. And she was talking a lot about how it was so exciting to finally see people who looked like her in her classes, and how excited she was coming to this predominantly white or traditionally white institution because of how diverse it was and how excited she was to be able to interact with other people who looked like her and to be in class with people who looked like her. So it was a really stark contrast that was really the intensity of the demographic makeup of those two those different institutions of those different communities made the experience of coming to a predominantly white institution really different, and I think made the when you think about acculturation, so it wasn't the same for all of them because they were having a very different experience in the ways that had happened for them before they got to campus, and then once they got onto campus, and it also really changed what they were seeking out when they got onto campus.
Thanks.
I don't know if that speaks to all of them, but I tried to get a few questions in there.
We actually have two more questions. And so the first one is a comment/question. You mentioned taking a critical perspective of the prior literature that had an urban or suburban assumption to the findings. Can you give an example of something in this arena? The person asking the question is fascinated by critical perspectives on literature that can go unchallenged.
So for the original, so I'm sorry, can you read the question again? I'm really focused to make sure I'm paying attention.
The question is, can you give an example of something in the arena that had of the literature review that had an urban or suburban assumption to the findings?
Yes, so I would say that a lot of the work that's being done now, there are definitely a lot of people who are already doing some critical work who are focused on rural communities already, again, that I think are trying to take that up with a critical perspective. But really what I'm speaking about when I think critical understandings, again, are thinking about the ways in which we define what is rural, how we understand what rural spaces are and what should be considered in that, the way that a lot more attention is spent on focusing on what is urban. Also, often when we look at when I talk about urban centric, I'm not just talking about the research, but the societal perspectives. And so there's a lot of work that's done that looks at sort of critically understanding media and the ways in which growing up that rural students are internalizing the fact that they have that they are less cultured, that they have fewer resources. And so the ways in which narratives are really built up around these ideas that one of the participants in the study said, I'm really tired of hearing, or she was saying, thank you for talking about this and asking me about where I'm from. You know, a lot of people don't think I have the internet, or they're surprised that I have these social media accounts because I came from these spaces. And she's like, that's not, I mean, and as a sidebar, yet there are a lot of internet challenges and there's a lot of infrastructure issues that do need to be addressed. But she's like, these assumptions are being made about how little knowledge or information I have. And people just think I come from the middle of nowhere. And she's like, but it's somewhere, it's important. And so it was these narratives that you could tell she had already heard coming onto campus, but also that past literature has found that a lot of rural students have internalized that they're coming from spaces that are under-resourced. And while in some cases that's true, a part of taking a critical look for that is not looking at just a deficit based, like not ignoring the fact that some of those resources don't exist, but being really asset-based and trying to ask the questions about what are the resources that do exist there, and what are the resources that they are bringing? What are these strong community ties that they have, telling them about ways to form community in new spaces, or the ways in which students would talk to me often about the ways in which they really enjoy being home because they appreciate the quiet of being in a smaller town. They appreciate the space that they have to wander, the ability to be in nature, so that they talk a lot about the resources and the assets that they had back home that they don't have anymore. And I think that's more what I'm speaking to, is the ways in which there are dominant narratives that talk about these as sort of places of deficit, and trying to reframe that in a way that talks about pulling people into these urban spaces and saying, no, there are resources there too, but we need to rethink what resources are, particularly in terms of these students who are coming to our campuses. Hopefully that begins to speak to that.
And that was actually going to be the last question from Dr. Millman, who asked this very, very early on, was based on your research, what are the recommended supports for rural Latinas?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different things. One, I think that making sure that we understand, so this is actually going to go back to a quote that I know a number of people who've ever heard me talk about this work have heard me talk about. There's a quote from Bell Hooks in the prologue to, actually, I believe it's both in her prologue to Appalachian Elegy, but she also discusses it in her book on belonging. And she talks about the ways in which, as a Black woman from a rural community, her narrative was erased from existence, so that all of the narratives that she was seeing around Black people were really around urban narratives, and all of the narratives that she was seeing around rural people were about white rural people, and that she really wanted to see herself in these narratives of what it meant to be Black and growing up in this rural community. And she speaks really beautifully about the ways that growing up in rural Kentucky taught her things about freedom and the ability to be out in nature, and these different things that were really valuable to her, but that those narratives she felt were really excluded sort of broadly. And so I think that I say that to say, I think that when we're thinking about supports for rural Latina students, is not assuming that they're necessarily the same supports that we'll need for our rural students more broadly, but they're also maybe not the same support like that if we've already been developing supports for Latina students in other spaces, that they might have unique needs coming from these small spaces. And so making sure that we're allowing the space for them to continue to tell their stories. Again, I think that predominantly some of the supports that I would really encourage are thinking about the ways that, since these matriarchs are clearly very important to these women, and it can be a strain being pulled away from them, thinking about the ways that we can support those connections that they still have in ways that are really healthy, that support the work that those who are back home supporting them are doing in that, but also that help them feel connected to our campuses, and that's healthy. And I'm sorry, I feel like I should have step back and take a caveat. There has been a lot of past research in higher education that has been criticized, and that now people are moving away from, that talked about a need to really separate students, to really separate from their family, from their past community, to fully integrate into their colleges. And while that's being challenged, I think that this only speaks all the more to the need to challenge those narratives, that we shouldn't be telling students to fully cut themselves off from their homes, from their families, from their past communities, but we should be thinking about how we can engage that support in really healthy ways, and how we can talk to everybody who's involved in the success of the student, not just the student themselves, in what makes sense for how they're supported while they're on our campuses. And that takes a lot more work, because you're not just thinking about how do I work with the student, but how do I work with a community that is important to the student. That's a lot bigger task to take on, but that doesn't mean that it's not important.
Dr. Stone, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I feel like I've talked way more than I would into a computer screen. So I appreciate everybody who bared with me through this. Thank you for allowing me the space to talk about rural students and about this work that I care about, and just allowing me the opportunity to share.
Well, on behalf of Dean Foyer and the entire GSHED community and the folks who showed up as our attendees today, thank you so very much. It was a wonderful, wonderful kickoff to our academic year 2021 Ecology of Education lecture series. So lots of people are virtually clapping for you right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thanks.
can see in the comments.
I was going to say.
Yeah. So. Okay.